Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Vikram Baliga about monster hunting some scary pests. It's Halloween, which means it's spooky time. Throughout history, humans have battled some pretty scary pests, from aphids to spider mites, whiteflies, and more. This episode, Vikram walks us through some of the scary adaptations these pests have had that have made them so effective, and progress we've made in fighting back the hordes. Don't forget to listen to the end of the show for our student spotlight. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsor for this episode, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about monsters. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Vikram Baliga with us. Vikram is the manager of the Texas Tech University Greenhouse and Horticulture Gardens and a lecturer of horticulture in the Department of Plant and Soil Science. He hosts the Planthropology podcast and co-hosts another podcast called In the Grow with Rachel Boyd. How are you doing today, Vikram?
I am so good. It's raining here for the first time. Well, it's rained a little bit, but we've gotten practically no rain in Lubbock, America all year. So I'm enjoying the cool, wet weather. It's wonderful.
Nice. Wonderful. Yeah, it's definitely getting into fall in the Midwest. So the leaves are changing and that's very pretty. And it's also getting late very early and cold. And I hate that. So it's a mixed bag.
Wait, what time does it get dark there?
Yesterday it was almost dark by 7:30.
Oh, that
between
feels
7:30
early.
and 8.
That feels early.
Yeah. But speaking of seasonal changes and gloomy weather and such, it is Halloween season, and so we wanted to have our dear friend of the show, Vikram Baliga, back on to talk about some kind of spooky pests. We are taking a little bit of a different angle this year. So we're kind of doing a little bit of a monster hunting thing. So we're going to talk about a few different pests and then how plants fight them off and how humans can best combat them as well to help people be well fed and cared for and get to enjoy a lot of the excellent products that different crops provide for us. So let's get started with the first one, which is aphids.
Aphids, everyone's favorite little soft-bodied smokestack insects. I'm going to use weird descriptions all day.
Perfect.
And it's just going to have to be all right.
So excited.
So I picked the insects I picked today were some that I think, regardless of what you're growing or regardless of what you're doing, they are things that are going to pop up over and over and over again in the greenhouse world, in field crops, in your home garden. And they pop up so much in some ways because they are good at being insects. But I think it's interesting that because we see them so much, we've come up with some really, really good ways to deal with them. And so we'll talk today about some of our strategies, like how you can, if you end up with a billion aphids in your backyard, what do you do about it? And then we'll also talk about what does nature do to help us out and sort of lend a hand a little bit. So aphids, if you have not seen them before, which I'm assuming most people listening to this probably have seen an aphid, and you have some sort of fight or flight response that is cycling up when you start thinking about these little friends. They're small, soft-bodied insects with long, slender mouth parts. Essentially, they hang out on leaves. They stick their little proboscis.
My gut instinct says proboscis, but that could also just be me wanting to sound fancy, and it sounds like the more fancy option.
I think we're going to stick with proboscis because I like it.
Perfect.
their mouth straws. They stick them into the vascular system of the plant, and they suck out all the carbohydrates, which is the thing that plants spend their time trying to make, right? Photosynthesis makes sugar water, essentially. And these aphids are like, I could use some of that in my life. And so they feed on them. And you'll see them on, honestly, pretty much almost any crop. Worse in a lot of horticultural crops, but there are cotton aphids and corn aphids and sorghum aphids, and pretty much they end up being everywhere. Some of the things that make these insects pretty successful is how quickly they sort of make the next generation, right? Populations pop up and explode pretty quick. So you'll go from, 10 aphids or 100 aphids on Friday, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to take the weekend off. And then you come back and there's 100,000 of them. Like their populations increase quickly. Interestingly, most of them are female clones. They go through something called parthenocarpy, which pretty much means that like you make a clonal offspring. So they make a whole bunch of little female aphids, and those little female aphids within a couple of days are ready to make more little identical female aphids. And then if there's pressure from an insect or chemical or whatever it is we're trying to do, they will say, oh, you know what? We need a male. There's chemical signaling. So they'll make males. And then those males introduce genetic diversity, and they can kind of out-evolve stuff pretty quickly. So they are a challenging pest to control on everything from tomatoes to sorghum. Luckily, we have come up with a lot of good mechanisms for dealing with them. And as long as, like with any integrated pest management, which is what we should really be practicing, right? We should be trying to do a little bit of everything and not just, oh, we're going to reach for the chemical first. We need to see what else is going on. But as with any kind of IPM, like we look for sort of natural, antagonists for our pests. And chrysanthemums are a major one.
Oh, okay.
Right? That seems like an unlikely place to find like help for dealing with bugs.
It's like homecoming boutonnieres to the rescue.
I'm in Texas, so you don't know how much that like when people say like homecoming mums or boutonnieres, I'm not thinking like normal size things. I'm thinking like things the size of tennis rackets that
everything's bigger in Texas,
drag you down to the ground. And, anyway, so chrysanthemums create a chemical called pyrethrin. Have you heard of that before? Have you heard that term before?
No, but I am flattered that you would think so.
Well, you talk to lots of plant people. I don't know. We get a lot of our insecticides from this. We call a whole class of our insecticides pyrethroids.
Okay.
We found them first in the flowers and leaves of chrysanthemums, because somebody, so much of our knowledge just comes from observation, and someone realized, well, these chrysanthemums are pretty pest-free. I wonder what it is about them. So early pyrethroids came from chrysanthemum flowers. It's a chemical that they produce, and it is actually a great sort of minimally toxic to humans and mammals and birds and fish sort of insecticide. But as a broad spectrum, it deals with tons of different little bugs that cause problems. So when we're dealing with aphids, you can do that kind of thing. If you have them on your house plants, you can make something called a safer soap, which is pretty much like dish soap with sometimes people will put a little bit of vinegar, of different things in it, and you can just wash them off, with a high pressure hose or whatever. But one of the things that there's two things that I think are really interesting about aphids. One of them is that because they're so squishy, lots of things like to eat them. So our little friend, the ladybug, is a voracious aphid destroyer. I saw this meme that was like, and I'll have to send it to you if I can find it.
Please do.
But the first panel is like a couple of people looking at a ladybug being like, so cute. Look how adorable it is. And the second panel is like this ladybug holding aphids in its hand, like biting the head off of one. And all the aphids are going, run. And it's actually true. So over their lifetime, a single ladybug can eat, I've read, between 5 and 10,000 aphids.
Holy cow.
So they will just constantly eat aphids.
How long do ladybugs live?
Like a few weeks.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What champions.
So they just spend all their time like just destroying aphids and other harmful pests. They're good at eating scale and whitefly and all kinds of stuff. Have you ever seen a ladybug larva?
No, I have not.
So since this is a Halloween episode, I think this is actually a fun time to talk about ladybug larvae. They look like little alligator monsters.
Perfect.
They're sort of like long and cigar shaped, and they're like orange and black striped. And it's funny because people will have ladybugs and they're like, sweet, they're dealing with our problems, whatever. And then you see these little monsters pop up, and people think they've got something worse than the pest they're trying to control. When in all actuality, they're just little larvae from our ladybugs.
Oh.
They can bite, which is weird to think about, like being attacked by ladybugs.
Mm-hmm.
But they eat more aphids and stuff in that life stage than actually they do as adults even. So
wow.
We can encourage our friends like ladybugs and lacewings. The larvae look very similar on a lacewing, and they also eat lots of aphids. And so plants have a lot of different strategies for attracting some of these sort of beneficial insects and keeping them there. So I think the best thing people can do really to manage a problem, especially with aphids, is just keep an environment that is conducive to our beneficial insects.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I really recommend not reaching for that chemical first, right?
Yeah.
You may get to a place, especially in a production setting, like a big production setting, where you don't have a lot of other options. And then, okay, you do what you got to do, right? But in general, if we can be adjusting our irrigation practice and our fertility practice and working with the plant's sort of natural defenses, we can do a good job of keeping a lot of our diseases and our pests at sort of a low threshold and still have things like tomatoes to sell.
Nice. I have many questions.
Okay.
So first question, if you just have a chrysanthemum that you're growing to put on a boutonniere, just the whole pot on a wrist, can you just like put that near your tomatoes? And is it like a area of effect, or are they like, that's not the same thing as this, and they're fine? Like, is there a zone of protection or no?
That's a really good question. To some extent, probably yes. And the reason for that is if some of you're almost using like a catch crop, right? It's like we plant things like marigolds or other things near our crops sometimes just so the insects go to that first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you plant a catch crop that when the insects go to, they die, it can have sort of like an area of effect. Now, you will still get some on your tomatoes or whatever, but no, you can actually have a pretty large impact by like planting antagonistic plants to your pests around the plants you actually want to keep.
Perfect. And then my other question is, two similar questions, is you mentioned that these female aphids just make more female aphids. And I'm wondering about this process. Like, I know certain things are just like, I'll just grow one off of my shoulder and it will fall off. And I feel like maybe that's not what is happening here. So is it like an egg thing? I'm gonna go out on a limb and say maybe it's probably not a live birth thing because it's a bug, but maybe it is. And I've set myself up to be a fool. How does all that work?
No, there's nothing foolish about it because they do give live birth, and it's super. Bugs don't do that. Like, it's super weird. So in mild climates, they can actually give birth to live offspring as many as 12 per day per aphid.
That's too many aphids.
That is
calm down.
Far too many. Yeah.
Chill out.
Too much.
Okay.
And so like each adult aphid during a warm week, they can have as many as 80 to 100 baby aphids that are clones of the mother that only need a few days to have their own new little clones per week.
Wow.
So each aphid can that's why we look at exponential growth, right? You go from one and they may be in a week be having 100 more ones. But then, like I mentioned, when they introduce a male because of whatever environmental pressure there are, they will actually lay eggs at that point.
Oh.
So they can either lay eggs or give live birth, and it's really weird.
That is super bizarre. So then that was my second question, is when these males show up on the scene, like, is this just like a conch shell that they're just calling out, or do they just miraculously like birth one? Is it like a queen and drone situation in reverse where they're just hanging out waiting? Like, you're getting a very clear picture of how I understand bugs in nature.
Well, but it's weird. It's weird. And so they can their like sexual dimorphism is a little strange, and it's very controlled by like environmental pressure and chemical signaling and stuff. So when some of these next generation are born, if either there is some kind of pressure from a chemical or there's pests present, it causes stress in the parent aphid. Sometimes it could be heat, it could be whatever else. And then it kind of signals that some of them need to sort of chemically change to male aphids. And so it's very much like external factors, because it's a lot easier for them to just give live birth over and over and over and like these populations to explode. But like when we start applying pressure to them, we can get males and we can sort of force them to make males, which is why if we're getting to a place where we're doing chemical control, we have to be really, really careful, because if we spray with something, we essentially are starting to force sort of evolution in these populations, right? Because we're sort of stressing them out and making males. Well, the ones that survive our chemical applications probably have some kind of resistance to that chemical. So if we're not practicing good resistance management, making sure we're getting like good kill on them, we can actually make some of these problems worse by spraying over and over.
Wow. That is wild. Just like speeding up the arms race between them. That's crazy.
Pretty much.
Okay, I decided also I will have an additional bonus question for each pest.
Okay.
What is the aphid's go-to Halloween costume?
So this is, I hope Danny DeVito doesn't like listen to the show.
I hope he does. I very much hope he does.
So I'm going to say they dress up as the penguin because they're kind of shaped like Danny DeVito.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool.
That's a weird answer, but that's what popped into my head.
That's solid. I had two options. I thought for sure you would snag one of them, so I created a backup.
Okay.
Vampire for sucking out all those plant juices.
That's a good
it's
one.
Easy, low-hanging fruit. And a stormtrooper. This is clones. Clones on clones on clones.
See, and I went with Danny DeVito, which is real weird.
Hey man, it's Halloween. It's a crazy time.
Oh man. Okay.
Okay. Second pest then is a hornworm.
A hornworm.
Go for it.
Yes. So hornworms are very big, very green caterpillars. And they turn into, have you ever seen like a hummingbird moth or a hawk moth?
I'm sure that I have, but I don't remember anything about them.
So they're these big fuzzy moths that essentially look like hummingbirds. They hover in place. They beat their wings real fast. They're even actually about the size of a hummingbird. They feed on the same plants. They have the same okay, they don't have a beak, but they're like proboscis are very like beak-like. And so people regularly can confuse hawk moths or hummingbird moths or sphinx moths. They're all kind of different names for hummingbirds. And so a lot of times people see them and they are very cool. And like, I like having them around. And they actually, it's interesting because they're found in different places throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually come from different species and sometimes even different genera of caterpillars. But they still kind of have this same sort of like adaptation to fill that niche in different, like coevolution is, or convergent evolution is really interesting to me, where like people, like things keep turning back into crabs. We don't know why. Or we always need a hummingbird moth. It's whatever. So these adult moths that come from the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm can have a wingspan of up to 5 inches. It's a big moth.
That's very large.
Like, again, bigger than a lot of hummingbirds.
That's like
sometimes.
a small human's face.
I have a small
large.
human. Yeah, that's accurate. He would be horrified if a moth landed on his face, and I would have to try hard not to laugh while I was trying to help. Anyway, I'm thinking now I have this mental picture of like walking around with my son and a moth just attaching itself to his face, and the fallout that would occur from that.
I also then went to slightly shorter than half of a Subway sub. Those are the only 2 measurements I have in my mind.
What would that cost? About $2.13?
So, something like that.
Instead of a $5 foot long. I don't know. Oh, goodness. So these little hornworms, they call them hornworms because they have a little horn on their butt. And it's there is to sort of make them look more intimidating to predators. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a defense mechanism. And if you look up pictures of these, it also looks like they have little eyes all over their body. They have stripes on them. A lot of these caterpillars are anywhere from like 2 to 4 inches long. They're pretty big, little chunky little guys. And they have these weird little horn butts. And they will absolutely massacre a tobacco or tomato crop. Anything in that Solanum family, they just go to town. 2 or 3 of these actually can defoliate like an entire couple of tomato plants overnight. They eat so fast.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so like if you ever walk out and your tomato plants are just sticks, there is a very good chance some of these hornworms are hanging around.
Oof.
So they're an interesting insect, and you'll usually see about 2 generations in a year. You'll see the larva most times in midsummer, but then sometimes if you get have a kind of a longer growing season, and you get them going into the fall, you may see a second generation in like late summer, early fall. They, again, can cause a lot of problems, both in the home landscape. I think probably people think about them more in their backyards because, you just go out and see them. But just think about having a few of these out in a field of tomatoes, or getting into a greenhouse full of tomatoes, or a tobacco crop. These are, high dollar, very important cash crops like throughout the world, but throughout North America for sure. And they eat the blossoms, they eat leaves, they eat the fruit. They'll eat everything essentially but the stem of the plant.
Yikes.
And so, in field settings, I think most growers don't wait too long to try to kill these guys. So they'll spray pretty early. And there are a lot of different like chemical controls that work pretty well. So a lot of our common insecticides, things like spinosad and a few of the others, do a pretty good job. We can also use an organic control called Bacillus thuringiensis, BT. So this is a bacteria that just lives in the gut of caterpillars and other caterpillar-like organisms. And so it replicates there. Essentially, they can't like get any nutrition from what they're eating, so it kills them that way. And it's a natural insecticide. It is a bacteria that's found out there. And when we think about like BT corn, BT cotton, that helps with like boll weevils and corn earworms and those kinds of things. They are actually taking genes from BT sticking it on the corn plant. So the corn has that same bacteria sort of in its system and the same like chemicals in its system that can control the hornworms or whatever other caterpillars.
Whoa.
So we can do some cool stuff with genetic modification, taking this wild bacteria that, if you're not a caterpillar, has zero effect at all on you, and just tell the corn, here's the genes, here's how you do the thing, you take care of them.
Wow. That's wild. Do they have like BT tomato and BT tobacco? I mean, it seems like that would be
I think
push.
I'm sure they've made that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about like GM crops, GMO crops, they're more accepted in certain crops than others.
Sure.
And so for a lot of our now, tobacco I would not call a horticultural crop, but it sort of toes those lines, right? We see less GM crops in some of these spaces than we do in like things like corn and soybeans and cotton and some of these others that we're growing in huge mass quantities. I think they could make those, and I'm sure they have made those. They're just not really on the market. They're not being used a lot. So what we do is we take BT and we spray it over the top instead, and we get sort of the same effect.
Sure.
So that's a good thing. Another common way to control it is with predatory wasps.
Okay.
So the thought of releasing wasps is a little disconcerting. But these are tiny, like 2 millimeter long wasps that, again, are not going to attack you at all. They go after the hornworms and other caterpillars. And it's kind of like, since this is a Halloween episode, we'll talk about some weird stuff that nature does. Essentially, the adult wasps lay their eggs in the caterpillar.
Okay.
So every now and then you'll see a hornworm walking around with eggs sticking out of its back. And then the little baby wasps hatch and sort of eat their way out.
Sure.
Which is horrifying.
Sure.
Especially if you're a caterpillar. But it's very effective. So you can release a lot of these little wasps, and usually they're fairly easy to get. You put them out there, and they just sort of do their things. We use them in a greenhouse setting as well. Because you can put these little cards. You actually buy like sticky cards that have a little. There's a little window on it with wasp eggs stuck to it, and you just hang them on your plants in the greenhouse, and they hatch and they fly around, and they eat your whitefly and they eat your hornworms and things like that. It's kind of cool. And so they'll eat the adult caterpillars, but as the larvae sort of emerge, they'll eat the eggs as well. So they're really effective at taking these populations down. One cool thing that plants do to deal with things like caterpillars, and not just the hornworm, but other caterpillars, we'll talk about tomatoes specifically. So tomatoes have something called trichomes. They're little hairs that stick. Tomatoes have a very distinct smell, like the tomato plants. If you've smelled a tomato plant, like it's probably in your head right now as you listen to this. Like they have a very distinct smell. That comes from what we call VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, that are stored in these little hairs along the stem. They're kind of fuzzy. As caterpillars start feeding on them, they release these volatile organic compounds, which the other tomatoes around them can detect, and they'll also start releasing these compounds even without the caterpillars feeding on them directly. It turns out that a lot of the predators of these caterpillars can also detect these compounds, and they'll start showing up. So essentially, one tomato gets attacked, it tells its buddies, you should also start sending out these signals, and then it attracts things like wasps and birds and other animals that are going to eat caterpillars. So they literally call for reinforcements as they're being attacked by different insects.
I love this. It's such a like sci-fi thing to be fighting off these hordes. I enjoy this very much.
Yeah, it's like when Gandalf shows up with eagles. Same deal.
Sure.
Yeah. Send them off. Get the eagles. Whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So then, what is your Halloween costume for a hornworm?
I like to think they're not very creative and they just dress up as a different caterpillar.
Mm.
So they dress up like the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland, and that's about as far as they're able to think ahead.
Oh, good. Yeah, I like briefly touched on like the very, very hungry caterpillar or whatever the book.
Hungry Caterpillar.
So that was one I considered. I had many. Another one that came to mind was like Riddler from Batman as like this very like weird tangent because you mentioned like Sphinx moths, and I was like, Sphinx loves riddles. So
yeah,
and then they're like green. They've got little like dots.
They have
and
the
stuff.
same, like, I can't explain it, but they have the same energy.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. You know, the Riddler always eating green things in Batman comics. This is his vibe. And then I think like maybe like a zombie or that one frog that like its babies just live in its back for a while because of
that's
like the
real
worm
alarming.
thing.
I've seen those and it's real weird.
Mm-hmm. So like those would be the very esoteric creative caterpillars are just they're making references to things that people are like, I don't even know what this is.
Yeah So they have to explain it.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like maybe I'm a caterpillar because like I feel like I go either one or two directions when I go like a Halloween party. It's either like, oh shoot, that's today and I have to come up with something, or I come up with something that's so, like you said, esoteric that people are like, now what are you supposed to be? Like, oh, well, if you read this, and yeah, I may be a caterpillar. I don't know.
I'm like a caterpillar in that I like to eat a lot and then sleep for long periods of time. And just not be around for a season, which is winter.
Yeah, that sounds nice, actually.
Perfect. So we're heading into caterpillar season. Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in more content like this? Like the plants he loves so dearly, Vikram Baliga has roots all over the podcasting and social media world. Check out his podcast, Planthropology and In the Grow, or his various hilarious social feeds. Links in the show notes. If you're a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsor, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Okay, third one with a bit of a Halloween-y name is spider mites.
Yes. So spider mites are little, kind of what they sound like. They're little mites. They're little arachnids. So a lot of our control strategies that work with, several of our other insects that we deal with don't necessarily work here because their biology is different. They work a little bit different. So a lot of times you'll see spider mites living on the underside of leaves, and you notice the damage when you start seeing like it kind of looks like speckling on the leaves. They feed on, like, they also have modified like piercing sucking mouth parts. So they feed similarly to an aphid. They're just so much smaller that they can actually like put their mouth parts into individual cells of the plant and like suck the juices out from individual cells instead of just like a whole big area. They're super tiny.
Wow.
And so you'll see them, like, you'll see plants sort of look like they're dusty at first, or like there's little spots of something on the leaves. And then you'll start seeing webbing. So they actually will make webs between leaves and all over plants. They're not like big, heavy webs like you would see from like a other spider, a big spider. But they definitely build webs. They are usually about 0.4 millimeters long or less as adults.
Wow.
So teeny, teeny, tiny. And they will attack everything from corn. We get spider mites on corn. They're really bad pests on cotton. So here in my part of the country, we have really bad spider mite problems because they are such a common cotton pest. And 98% of our planted acres are cotton.
Wow.
And but you'll also see them attacking trees. So a lot of conifers, especially cypress and I think firs, are really susceptible to spider mite damage. So these are sort of a generalist. They go after lots and lots of different kinds of plants. There's lots of species of them as well. You typically start to see them in sort of hot, dry climates. Again, which makes them real great for where I live because it is those things all the time. And they tend to be more active during the summer, but some of them will continue to be active throughout the fall. They can cause a lot of damage, and one of the reasons that they are so hard to deal with is because of where they live. So they live on the underside of the leaves, and so when we're trying to like spray for them, it's hard to get chemical to them. You can't use the same strategy of like over-the-top broadcast spraying or crop dusting or whatever, because a lot of times, unless you're using a really potent systemic, it never gets to the insect themselves. So you almost have to spray from underneath the canopy. Also, the webs are so fine textured that they'll actually catch and stop droplets of things before they hit the spider mites, before they get to the plant, and allow them to evaporate before they can really penetrate into the leaf surface, get to the mites themselves. So they kind of like defend themselves in some really interesting ways.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of chemicals that we can use to deal with them. But typically that we try to use different miticides. There are 3 or 4 others, and I don't know that we need to get into necessarily like different specific products, but there are like synthetic and organic products that you can use for miticides. Horticultural oils actually work really well. Because of the way that like arachnids breathe, if you can like put oil on them and cover them up, usually they can't breathe and you'll start to see populations dropping off. Some people will actually just spray them with water and just blast them off the leaves. They don't deal with water well, and they don't travel very far because they're so small. So if you can get them off the plant, whichever way you can usually keep them under control. So a lot of people that have spider mite problems will just take like a water hose with a fairly strong setting and just like spray their plants off once a week or something to try to keep them away. Usually when you start seeing them pop up, like they will also like increase in population fairly quickly. Not as fast as aphids, but fairly quickly. But there are a lot of things that eat them, which is also really helpful. So lacewings and our ladybird beetles or our ladybugs, like with our aphids, are really great for control. But usually there are other types of mites. So there are predatory mites out there, which are a little bit bigger, usually sort of a bright red. Spider mites, by the way, and I didn't say this earlier, are these tiny little reddish brown insects. The way that I tell people to test for them, especially in their cypress trees and things like that have a denser foliage, is take a white sheet of paper and tap the leaves on your sheet of paper. If the little things that look like pollen grains or dust start running around, you probably have spider mites. And this is especially true in trees, but any plant that you're dealing with that you suspect, take a white sheet of paper, tap it on there, and that's a great way to check for them. The predatory mites are sometimes about twice as large, so they're pretty big and they're bright red. And you can buy them. There's lots of places that will sell them. You can release them into your fields. The one caveat I have for any type of biological control is you need to be real sure what you're dealing with. Right. Some things are native to some areas. Some are invasive in other areas. They may, outside of their native habitat, eat everything but the spider mite you're trying to control. We have to be really careful when we use biological control that we don't, end up with cane toads or whatever. There are lots of great success stories in biological control, but there are a lot of things that have gone wrong as well. So before you again, that's why I typically encourage people to sort of adjust the environment to sort of disincentivize your pests, but maybe be more beneficial for your beneficial insects, so that you don't have to order anything in, because you don't know where it's coming from. Sometimes it can be a problem. Like even ladybugs. Like I tell people not to buy ladybugs. Usually they are either an exotic species that's brought in, or a lot of them come from Southern California, where they're just sort of like captured and then sent other places. So there are native ladybugs probably wherever you are. You just have to sort of encourage them, like leave some leaf litter, make sure there's water out, those kinds of things.
Sure.
Another good way to deal with mites is like late in the winter. So they'll start getting active as it warms up. They a lot of times will overwinter, especially on trees, in like cracks between the bark, things like that. They kind of hide in there. So you can use something called a dormant oil, which is essentially you spray it up the trunk, or you spray it on your plants while the plants are still dormant and while the eggs are dormant. And essentially it keeps them from ever like emerging and coming out. So preventative strategies are usually our best bet as much as possible.
Sure. So
plants struggle with these. Like, whereas some of the other ones we've talked about, they have a lot of really cool like adaptive behaviors and like chemicals and things to deal with it. Plants struggle a little bit more with spider mites because they sort of resist a lot of chemicals and stuff that plants put out there. So again, our best bet with dealing with this is to use the least toxic chemical possible that's effective, or just try to make a good environment for all of our beneficial insect friends.
Sure. So obviously, when they're so small, it would be easy to be like, well, what can they even do if they're so little? So, I mean, I know you mentioned that they're basically, just poking holes in them all the time. Like, is that just make the plant sick or not have as good of yield, or is it actively murdering them? What are the types of damage that you're getting from spider mites over like a season?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially, since they're feeding on like individual cells, they are taking away the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So as they kill these cells, like the chloroplasts die along with them, right? So when you get a little bit of damage, you see some spotting, and normally the plant doesn't show like much overall damage at first. Like the leaves will start looking a little rough. They'll start kind of, my plant doesn't look super healthy, but it's not wilted. It's not drying out. But then it crosses a point where the plant is no longer able to sort of like maintain its biology because its photosynthetic rate has dropped so far. This is going to be a weird analogy, but it actually fits pretty well. You've seen The Martian, the movie The Martian?
Yes.
So, okay, he is using solar panels to charge up his rover and stuff like that. And over time, like the dust starts to collect on his panels, and he doesn't even realize that his power is like dropping, that he's not getting that recharge that he needs, until one day, like his rover won't run because he's lost so much of that solar capturing capability. It's exactly the same thing in our plants. Over time, you sort of reduce that plant's ability to capture sunlight, and then it can't maintain itself. And you hit like a critical point where, oh no, like I can't do anything. And then that plant craters quickly. So there is a little bit more lag time in terms of the damage that happens, but it can be a lot more widespread, right? Because you don't notice it at first. Mm-hmm. You come out and one of your tomato plants has no leaves left on it. You're like, oh no, there's a problem.
Yeah.
And then you deal with it quickly. So this is a little bit sneakier because it can take a while to build up.
Oof. Spooky. Okay. What is your Halloween costume for a spider mite?
I tend to think of them, and again, this is weird, as like circus performers. And I don't know why that's in my head, but when I think about spider mites, I'm thinking about like the cast of The Greatest Showman, where they're dancing and they've got little hats. And mm-hmm. I don't know why. That's just what popped into my head.
All right.
I don't think any of my answers make any sense.
I mean, a ringleader wears a red jacket, so that's fine.
They've got all those legs. I don't know.
Maybe it's like a flea circus thing where it's just like groups of small creatures all working in concert to achieve a thing. There you go. I can go with that.
Okay.
I thought for sure you would say Spider-Man because that's like the easy.
Well, of course, that's
like
what I should have said.
The easy option. Although, so I was like, okay, well, what could I like do to take that beyond? Because I can never de-escalate, only take it further. So I thought, you know, those costumes where it's like the top half of you is like a cowboy and then you have like an inflatable horse or something, or it's like an inflatable person and they're like carrying your head or something, you know?
Yep.
I'm imagining that, but it's the spider mite attached to a large inflatable version of Spider-Man, so it's the logo on his chest. Although, now that your answer made me think they could also do that with like a hand and be the spider that bit Spider-Man.
Oh, that's
that
a
might
good
be
one.
Like more easy for them to just be attached to one inflatable body part than an entire human.
I'm starting to worry about how my brain works because obviously Spider-Man is the right answer. And my brain was like, no, we're not going to get there. Maybe if I'd had another 20 minutes, we'd have gotten there.
I'm not sure that you should be less worried, Lo, like because of my answer. like mine is like, no, just be a logo. An inflatable person is my correct answer, which might be worse.
Or they could, you know, those costumes that like one person's the head of a horse and they're the back of the horse. They just wear like the head of a horse on them. So they like, I don't know.
Yeah. Like, one of those like horse masks that were like a really big thing for a long time. I could see that energy.
Yeah.
I was also thinking of like Carnage from Spider-Man because it's just like a big mass of red gloopy pieces causing havoc.
Carnage is a good bad guy.
Yeah. It's pretty good. Yeah. All right. Speaking of pretty good bad guys, this seems to be your arch nemesis bad guy, the whitefly. So tell me about whiteflies.
Well, they're little white flies. We are not creative when we name things. Sometimes.
It tracks.
It does.
I know what to imagine, so that's good.
It is a teeny tiny little white fly. And so if you're in a greenhouse or in a field and there's lots of little white flies, they're probably white flies. So as a greenhouse manager, this is one of probably the most difficult pests I deal with because they attack pretty much anything. They are very much like generalists. Like there's not a lot I see that will like chomp on cacti and succulents, but whitefly don't care. They'll do the thing. So they'll feed on lots of different plants. Their populations explode quickly. A lot of chemicals are not super effective against them because they have such large populations. We see lots of resistance. And in the ag world, that's one of the spookier things I can think of is like chemical resistance. At some point, we start to run out of tricks, you know? And if we're not careful with resistance management, we can. This is an aside, but I was at a grower meeting one time and a rep from a company was asked, well, what's the herbicide of the future? This is changing gears just a little bit. And he said, tempered steel. So the point he was making was that at some point we run out of chemical control when we're back to chopping weeds out of a field. Well, similar things are true with insects. And so if we're not really, really careful with that, like whitefly for sure, there are a few that are like totally resistant to things like the pyrethroids I talked about earlier, and even some like imidacloprid and other systemic insecticides. And in my experience, one of the reasons these are spooky is when I start having to deal with big whitefly infestations, I start getting into like classes and categories of products that I really don't want to have to spray, like some of the more scarier ones, right? That we're wearing respirators and full body suits to apply. So they can be a problem for sure. And plants do have some good deterrents. We actually had some soybeans in our greenhouse for a while, and it turns out the soybeans that have like hairier leaves and the same is true with cotton, are more susceptible to whitefly for some reason. But varieties that have sort of shed that, like they don't have the little hairs on their stems and leaves and things like that, seem to have far less whitefly damage. And so I don't know what that mechanism is. It's just observational. But some of our older sort of races of some of these plants seem to be more susceptible. And so the plants are coming up with strategies. Generally, what we see is the whitefly tend to go after plants that are a little bit stressed to begin with. So if they're maybe not as healthy as they should be because of water or fertility or whatever, you'll see these problems get worse faster. But these are not just a greenhouse pest. We see them in the garden and the landscape and in ag production. So there are quite a few chemicals that deal with them. Usually it has to be something that's pretty potent or that is a strong systemic. So as they feed on, they also have like piercing, sucking mouth parts. So same kind of thing. They over time just sort of suck the juice out of like a vampire, the lifeblood out of the plant. It's not great. It's less than ideal. But because there are so many of them, lots of different predatory insects will go after them. Again, from our friends, the ladybugs and lacewings, which seem to go after pretty much anything, to, again, our tiny little predatory wasps, which we've actually found a lot of success with in the greenhouse is using some of these predatory wasps when we're dealing with our whitefly. They can really, like, they're not going to kill all of them, but they'll keep the population in check enough that we can manage them with other strategies as well. So, and again, a lot of plants will call in their wasp reinforcements, the Air Force or whatever, when there's a problem. And it's pretty cool how how these ecosystems, if we let them, sort of start balancing themselves out. But ultimately, we have to grow plants. And like you said, there's people that need food. And so if our sort of choices are between losing a crop or spraying a chemical, well, we're going to spray a chemical.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a tough one. That's the big bad. Halloween costume.
So they're kind of interesting looking. Their wings lay flat against their body, and they're not a moth, but they sort of hold them back like against their body. They kind of look like tails to me, like coat tails. So like I see them as like fancy old businessmen or whatever, or again, like a vampire, but not the sparkly kind, like the old fancy kind that would like wear a tuxedo or something like that. That kind of like fits for me.
Oh, nice. I like that. I like that a lot. Mine are not that reasonable. I thought of the Borg from Star Trek.
Okay.
Super pale, just gonna go after everything. Similarly thought of the Blob from the classic horror movie.
The Blob.
I thought of an angel because I feel like they would be like, oh, look, we're fine. We're not a problem. We're like a good thing you want around. Yeah. And, white robe. I don't know. It seems like they are actually physically white in color.
No, they are. Yeah.
So, okay. And then I thought of, on a similar note to the Borg, the aliens from Independence Day, because I just rewatched that movie the other day.
Ooh, that's a good one.
And then also that gives you the bonus Ladybug Will Smith.
I like that. That's a good one.
Yeah. So
what would Bill Pullman be in that?
Is that you? Are you Bill Pullman?
Am I Bill Pullman? Oh, if only.
You might be Bill Pullman in this scenario.
I might be. I'm okay with that. We will not go quietly into that good night.
You got Jeff Goldblum vibes, Vikram.
Oh no.
Can you be anybody except Jeff Goldblum in that movie? Noticing the problem before everybody else, knowing their strategies, finding out how to ultimately beat them.
Oh God, I'm Jeff Goldblum.
You are the Jeff Goldblum of Independence Day in this analogy.
There's a lot to unpack there.
I think that explains the entirety of our previous conversation up until now. Every answer you've given to every question.
That actually fits so well. It's a little scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And also appropriate because Jeff Goldblum was in The Fly. So,
Oh, he was. This is making a lot of sense.
Evil twin Vikram is Jeff Goldblum in The Fly joining forces with the enemy.
Yep. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm gonna worry about that a little bit.
You shouldn't. He's a gem. National treasure.
I actually love
man.
Jeff Goldblum.
He's great. He's excellent.
He had a show on TV that was great.
If he's listening with his best friend, Danny DeVito, we love you both. On that very professional, very serious note, I do want to say thank you so much for being on. Obviously, these are pests that do, a lot of serious damage economically, for food security, for, just all of the things that get affected when crops get taken out. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through how we can fight these different varieties of pests and help farmers along the way and horticulturists and all of that good stuff. Thank you as always for lending your expertise and good vibes and humor to the show, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. That was lots of fun. I appreciate it.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Elena. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi, Abby. My name is Elena Jacobs, and I'm a PhD candidate in Integrated Plant and Soil Sciences at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. I work in Dr. Rebecca McCulley's Grassland Ecology Laboratory, and prior to my time as a PhD student, I worked as an agronomist for USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, where I helped agricultural producers implement conservation practices in Arizona, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Kentucky as a certified crop advisor.
Great. And what are you currently researching?
What I'm researching now is the environmental effects of biocannon A feed supplementation on sheep production. So biocannon A is a natural product found in red clover, which is a nutritious pasture forage. Feeding cattle biocannon A increases weight gains by modifying the rumen microbial communities. I measure gas emissions that come from soils amended with urine from sheep fed biocannon A to determine whether biocannon A can reduce ammonia or methane losses into the atmosphere. And so this would make feeding red clover beneficial from both an animal production and an environmental standpoint.
Wonderful. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
Well, I want to help develop agronomic recommendations to bring this innovative biocannon A research into focus for farmers. So evaluating how red clover can be managed in hay and grazing systems to maximize these biocannon A levels could help promote more efficient livestock production. So my husband and I raise beef cattle, and we're personally interested in these strategies to make our operation more sustainable from an economic and a conservation standpoint. So we know in the future that demand for livestock products and the importance of conserving resources will increase. And I want to be part of that movement to find sustainable strategies to help farmers do this.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Elena about her work, we'll have her contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.